Brisk winter morning. The birds are carrying on. The grass, as you can see behind us, is getting taller and taller. It's been raining. Look, I'm interested in looking at four concepts today. I don't know if we'll have time in the next 20 to 25 minutes, but I'm interested in looking at the concepts and the interrelation of class, culture, race and identity politics. I'll repeat it again. Class, culture, race and identity politics. I think the first thing we need to do is clarify what the statement means. Now, when I talk about class, I'm not talking about the traditional Marxist division of labour, but I'm talking about a class system which is more relevant to the 21st century, especially in Western societies. And you've got four distinct classes in Australia and most of the Western society. You've got the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who've been getting richer and richer during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution, which we've experienced over the last half a century. And then you've got people with disposable income. Whether you're blue collar or white collar is irrelevant. Whether you're professional or non-professional is irrelevant. What's relevant is whether you have disposable income at the end of the day to actually get involved in investing, whether it's housing, stock market, gold, bullion, whatever it is. And about 8% of the Australian population have disposable income and classified as investors. Now you can be a cook, you can be a chef, you can be a doctor, you can be a railroad, you can be a construction worker. But the key at the end of the day is disposable income. The third group, which makes up the bulk of the society, which is about 50 to 60%, around 60%, are wage earners. These are people who are either in small business, who pay themselves, or people who are working for corporations, councils, governments, small business. But people who at the end of the day, once they pay all their bills, don't have any disposable income to actually invest. And then you have the 35% of Australians who rely on social security benefits to survive, whether it's a student allowance, a disability support pension, a single parent's benefit, old age pension. So they're the four distinct classes, at least in Australia and most of the Western world. Now when you talk about culture, culture is a distinct entity which is practiced by a specific group of people. There have been tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of different cultural practices, cultural experiences, cultural interrelationships. Some are religious based, but most are secular based. A classic example is New Guinea, where you have 700 different tribal groups, and most of these tribal groups have different cultures, different languages, because of the geographical isolation which they experienced. So every specific group of people has a specific culture. Even here in the 21st century, we have a culture of consumption. That's what capitalism is about. It's a culture of consumption. And then we have race. Race is not genetic. Race is a social construct. You can have racial groups based on a religious affiliation. For example, Jews. And obviously there are people who identify as Jews who have no religious affiliation but accept those cultural practices. And then if you look at the Australian First Nations people, you have a wide range of cultural practices practiced by people with a specific social construct. Then when you look at Western society, we have a different view on what race is. And we use terms like white, black, yellow. We kind of simplify it to its colour. It reminds me of my experiences in the Northern Territory pre-cyclone in 1972. When you went to the pub, you didn't ask for a particular brand of beer, you asked for a yellow, blue, green. It's the same in Western culture in terms of what is described as race. It's specifically seen as colour. So race, to a significant degree, is a social construct. And then you have identity politics. What's identity politics? Well, that's when your identity, whether it's male, female, non-binary, gay, straight, lesbian, white, black, pink, whatever, is the dominant feature of your existence. It's your identity which defines who you are. So these are the four things I'd like to interlink. Class, culture, race and identity politics. In Western society, we have seen the growth of identity politics to such an extent that it dominates almost every aspect of everyday life. But at the same time, we have seen an aversion to class analysis. What we've seen is the failure to create an egalitarian community through maybe Marxist philosophical and socialist philosophical and ideological doctrines lead to a much easier mechanism of identifying yourself, and that's through identity politics. Because see, identity politics can be easily incorporated into the private investment for private profit mantra very easily. And when you throw the concept of race in, it becomes almost ludicrous. Not all white people are the same culture or belong to the same class. Black people, yellow people, whatever colour you want to talk about them. So breaking up race in terms of colour of a person's skin is ludicrous. Because what's happened in Western society is that we have seen a sharpening of class divisions. And to tell somebody who's on a social security benefit they have the benefit of white privilege is ludicrous. It's a ludicrous way of actually understanding the type of society we have. Now the death of Henry Belafonte is quite interesting. Now Mr. Belafonte is a well-known actor, died at 99, long, glorious history as an actor, but his story as a black social activist, as a radical activist, as a member of the United States Communist Party, hasn't even been mentioned during all the accolades which have been praised on him since his death a few months ago. Because ultimately, it really doesn't matter who has their foot on your neck, whether it's a black foot or a white foot or a yellow foot or a gangrenous foot. It doesn't really matter, because the ultimate problem is the foot on the neck. And to think that people who are defined by a social construct called race are all the same is totally ludicrous. We see this in the debate surrounding the voice, the referendum, which people will have to make a decision about, well, we'll make a decision about later on in the year. And I've spoken about my position on that in the past. But to think that people of a different colour have of the same colour, have the same mindset, have the same culture, have the same religious practices is ludicrous. That's why identity politics has been such a failure in terms of addressing the fundamental inequalities which exist in society. Those inequalities which are based on class. You can go to any African nation you like and you will see those inequalities. You will see black ruling classes oppressing working classes and people who are not even part of the economic system. You go to the Middle East, classical example of oppression of whole societies with the same culture, same social construct, same racial origin, being oppressed by their own people. Now we have a term which we like to use in the West, honorary white. But the dilemma is that identity politics does not actually address the main issue. And the main issue today, in the 21st century, can be summed up in 4 specific terms. 1, increasing population growth. 2, finite resources, irrespective of how smart we are and how much genetic engineering is going to happen and how much artificial intelligence there is. The fact is that we have finite resources on the planet. The other problem we face is the fact that the world economy, whether they call themselves communists or socialists or capitalist or Califumpian, is based on a simple principle: private investment for private profit. Capitalism. That's why the problem is the same the world over. Look at Myanmar. The structural inequalities. Look at India, look at Australia, look at the United States. Rich nations or poor nations, sovereign nation states with extraordinary amount of resources like our own, or sovereign nation states like Bangladesh with minimal, if no resources, apart from increasing human population and a huge refugee population from Myanmar. The fact is that the ultimate problem faced by us as human beings, whether it's the climate emergency, increasing greenhouse emissions because of the type of production we have decided we will follow, ultimately the type of society we create is based on that struggle for equality. Not equality of opportunity, but equality of decision-making power. Equality in terms of access to the resources which are held in common. And that struggle for equality has been put on the back burner. And even the struggle to address the climate emergency is a struggle of transforming a coal-driven capitalism into a solar, wind-driven capitalism. So the underlying concepts don't change. Irrespective of how you identify and irrespective of the personal freedoms you may be able to enjoy because you have successfully been able to identify with other people with specific characteristics or specific needs. The fact is that growing inequality, which is such a significant part of everyday life, as we see in this country with the growth in interest rates, and who benefits, because ultimately inflation and growing inequality is basically due 70% is due to increasing corporate profits. Simple. That's the facts. So it doesn't matter, ultimately, whether identity politics is successful or not. The fact is that most demands that are made by people seeking equality because of their specific criteria, whether it's the colour of their skin, whether it's their cultural origin, the fact is that ultimately they can be incorporated. Identity politics can and is incorporated. Oh, there we go. I told you it was a brisk morning. Can be incorporated into the capitalist system. And we see governments now using identity politics as a mechanism via which to win office and then use their position to actually fossilise the inequalities that exist in society. So although identity politics may have some benefits for individuals, it doesn't actually have benefits as far as class division is concerned. And that's why we continue to see grinding poverty in First Nations communities in this country. Because ultimately it's about land, access to resources, whether you can practice your culture or not, irrespective of what that culture is ultimately dependent, as the birds are now telling us, on access to a real world. Access to food, to shelter, to land, air, and the list goes on and on. So to divide us in terms of identity politics, to think that a particular word that identifies you is going to resolve your issues as far as inequality is concerned is irrelevant. Because ultimately, it's a question of power. Who exercises power? Who benefits from the exercise of that power? Do we have a parliamentary system which benefits the representatives? Or do we have a parliamentary system which benefits the people who elect or appoint those representatives? And it's the same in other countries, whether it's a dictatorship or not. Ultimately, the type of society it is, and whether there is social cohesion or not, is totally dependent on access to resources and power. So think about it. Class, culture, race, identity politics. For us to continue down that road, creating more and more and more and more subsections as far as identity politics is concerned, is ultimately a waste of time. The struggle to share power and hold wealth in common is the struggle that needs to be reassessed, readdressed in the 21st century.